Right. So.
All yours.
Right. Okay. I'm really sorry for the sort of delay. The technology lets you down, but of course, when it works, it's great. But occasionally, it sort of befuddles you. But hey, there you go. That's the sort of it's a first world problem, as they say. Okay, so what we're looking at today is what can we do, or what are we trying to do in the discussion chapter? And in many ways, the discussion chapter is kind of the most crucial bit, although that's not to say that all the other bits are equally crucial, but the discussion chapter is where you're actually sort of demonstrating your ability to make the connections. You've hopefully given a sort of good account of why you've used a particular methodological approach. So you've understood all the philosophical aspirations and sort of considerations and difficulties and whatever else. But this is the bit where you actually sort of start to sort of put it all together. And as you see in bullet point 2, the theory, which is will be included in your literature chapter, where you've demonstrated what it is that sort of the background knowledge to sort of the topic that you're interested in, but more particularly, or at least then you make reference to the sort of the data which will have appeared in a data chapter. And this is where some of the difficulties arise, where you've presented this. But I mean, and in the classical sort of scientific study, you sort of present your sort of charts, as it were, whatever came out of the experiment. And this is the sort of the chapter, or the discussion chapters, where you actually sort of make sense. I also appreciate, or I do appreciate very fully, that when we're dealing with more inductive studies, there is a sort of whilst you're presenting data, there is a danger of discussing at the same time. So there can be a sort of crossover, and that's one of the things I'll sort of look at. But most particularly, what you're demonstrating is the sort of the ability to make sense of whatever it is that you've discovered on your research journey, and then you link it back to sort of whatever the sort of the literature you started off with. Although I always allow the sort of the option to sort of say, well, to not say, but to actually sort of demonstrate that what you found in your research journey didn't actually sort of align with whatever was being presented in terms of the empirical data. In that sort of sense, you can provide a different sort of interpretation. And of course, I use that word very deliberately, insofar as you're able to offer, or to proffer, which is what I really like, a better and more faithful account of what goes on. And in so doing, the explanation or becomes better theory, as it were. So of course, you see there sort of critique, sense making, and theory building. These are all sort of words which we'll sort of we'll talk about during the course of the next few minutes in sort of terms of looking at this chapter. And most particularly, if you can then, in so doing all of this, or in this chapter in particular, demonstrate your ability to sort of to offer new knowledge, then that should, in theory, be all that is required. I say that in sort of very sort of throwaway manner, that there's obviously a lot more to a PhD viva, or indeed any research paper for that matter. But nonetheless, if you've been able to demonstrate that, then of course you've ticked one of the most important boxes of being part of the research community. Okay, without further ado, okay, here's when I was preparing for this, I sort of, you always look around and see what's available. And it was a really good, it's a research paper, it's a publication produced by sort of the University of Southern California in terms of their research guides. And I thought, well, okay, it's all there. So I've used the information there and adapted to suit the purposes here today, which of course is part of what the sort of the research game always is to know what exists and then to develop it and build upon it. Okay, right, so here we go. What's meant by discussion? Well, obviously we engage in discussion all the time. We are, if nothing else, dialogical creatures, insofar as that if we meet somebody, provided we speak the same language, and indeed even if we don't, we use semaphore, we engage in understanding what the other person is talking about, or their background. I mean, it happens all the time. And of course, what we'd like to do is we sort of like to meet people who've got similar views, and therefore we can sort of share our experiences. So, but in a more formalized setting, which of course is what we're talking about today, we're looking at the sort of the things that we've found in the sort of the pursuit of knowledge or data more particularly, but which will sort of feed into new knowledge, we hope, that have particular relevance to a research problem. So again, in bullet point one, the point about sort of literature is it's the thing that sort of tells us what is already there, or it's the sort of the body of knowledge, if you will, that tells us what is the background to whatever we're interested in. And again, I do add the caveat here. It's very easy to talk in general and abstract terms. And part of the difficulty, I think, that sort of people have at this stage is that they may have started off on a very broad trajectory, if I use another big word, and of course the difficulty then is that trying to link it back in, or link whatever they've discovered into sort of to existing theory. So the tip I would give here is that the more you can bound your study, and I talked about this last week, and I always say this to students, keep it sort of as narrow as possible, because it make your job easier. Whereas if you've got to discuss everything, the world and everything, it becomes an impossible sort of task. So, okay, so what you're offering is the understanding of insights that have emerged during the study. Now, of course, quite clearly, if you're doing a hypothetical deductive study, then did the data sort of, did it prove what you thought? Did it disprove? It's fairly straightforward. Again, I say in sort of fairly flippant way, not meaning to be so. There's obviously a lot more to it than that. But of course, in a lot of the studies that I've been involved in, which are sort of much more inductive in nature and qualitative, to use that other word, the discussion is trying to sort of to grapple with a lot of what appear to be complexities and divergences, and trying to keep the sort of connections as relevant as possible. So of course that is also important. So discussion should always connect to the introduction by ensuring the research questions, or hypotheses, if you will, have been reviewed. And of course, the advice here is it should not simply repeat or rearrange the literature chapter, because of course the point about all of this is that if you've done a good enough job in the previous chapters, it stands on in its own right. At this point, what you're trying to do is to sort of to assemble it and to engage in the sense-making process. And of course, what the discussion should do explains how your study advances the reader's understanding of the research problem, where you left in the sort of the review of the sort of the research, sort of the review of prior research, which of course is in the literature chapter. So again, the point about all this is, and in the discussion chapter, it's at this stage you may start to see, as I sort of alluded to a couple of moments ago, some of the sort of the deficiencies, or the sort of the dead ends that sort of emerged. And my one piece of additional advice at this stage is that if you've written a literature chapter, and at this stage there are things in that sort of no longer seem relevant, because of course the sort of research has moved on, or maybe you discovered different things as a consequence of sort of being in the field, as we sort of might call it, or indeed even from the experiments that you carried out, but it's more normal in qualitative research. You've got to then make a sort of decision. Do you leave that sort of literature, or whatever it is that you've discussed, in its present state? Because of course it goes nowhere if it doesn't link to data. Its status becomes suspect or questionable, and so this is where you may have to engage in a bit of a cult, and you may have to sort of re-review the literature. But again, I'm assuming that you've done this in a sort of fairly straightforward and linear way. But beware of that can often be a sort of problem if you've got things that, as I say, are no longer entirely relevant, or as relevant as you may have thought they would be at the outset of the study. And of course, that's part of the sort of the process that we're all involved in, is constantly sort of looking backwards to see where we started from, because the sort of the journey may have been somewhat different. Okay, I mean, this is a kind of repeat, isn't it? But the discussion chapter is important because it shows that you can critically, and of course, to formulate critical solutions, or creative solutions, if I get this the right word. So think critically to formulate creative solutions, and based upon a logical synthesis of the findings. And of course, as I keep trying to point out, the findings may go in different directions. So being able to sort of to keep that under control and to sort of to see where it's taking you is part of the skill, and something that you have to sort of be able to sort of to adequately demonstrate to the examining team who are going to sort of look at this thing in terms of its worth. But quite clearly, what it will be about is to sort of formulate deep and profound understanding of the research problem and issues. And again, the caveat I would add on there, the health warning, is remember that the sort of the research questions that you set may have been quite deliberately vague and broad to allow you to sort of get going, and they may have to also be refined. And again, this is something which I think that you'll also sort of need to sort of to address in the sort of the methodological chapter, perhaps, or indeed it could be in the discussion chapter, where you describe how the research questions, if that's what you've used, have had to be sort of refined during the process of investigation. And that's perfectly sort of logical, because what you think is going on may not be sort of entirely accurate, or and again, it's not so much that it's not accurate. If you're sort of outside or external to the sort of the research issues as they exist in the field, then why should you, or how would you know? Obviously, it's very different in terms of insider research. There is, Silverman, who's a sort of a seminal writer in this regard, he describes this as reconfigured knowledge, insofar as the sort of the idea that the research question that you start off, the research question that you present may be very different to sort of where you started off. And I often think that in the discussion chapter, what you may wish to sort of to present, even though, as I say, reconfigured knowledge, it looks good, and it provides this sort of sense of linearity by being able to discuss why you altered the sort of the direction or the sort of the focus. It's a very valuable sort of lesson, because that shows that you are sort of open to sort of to new ideas or new notions, or sort of data that sort of didn't entirely align with what you thought you were going to get in the first place. So again, the other warning I would add is that it can seem a bit like you're sort of re-engaging in methodology, but there will also probably be a degree of this. I use this other word, agonizing, but because the difficulty often is that we often like to think that this process will be very straightforward. It'll be entirely sort of, it'll follow the path that we preconceive, but there's great dangers in that, because if nothing else, you miss things which are really interesting, and most particularly if you then start to sort of to find out things that you didn't sort of anticipate, precisely because, of course, it wasn't included in the literature. Well, that's missing a really great opportunity, but of course it takes you off in different paths. But nonetheless, what that allows you to sort of do is to present sort of knowledge which actually sort of more faithfully represents the sort of the lies, if you're sort of doing a qualitative piece of work, which truly represents or provides a faithful account of the people involved in the sort of thing that you're interested in. Okay, so presents underlying meaning of the research, explores potential implications, and considers potential improvements. And of course, this is the sort of the big one as far as I'm concerned. If you can sort of advance existing theory as contained in the literature, then you've done a sort of really good job in as being sort of a competent researcher. Secondly, or the second part of this, because there's a second page here, emphasize the way your research will contribute to understanding of the problem, identify it and its place in the discipline, because of course that's always important. What are you doing to sort of to achieve situating the knowledge that you've got? And of course, the other thing this has been sort of covered previously in DocHub, and I'm sure will probably be done in sort of the future. Research gaps, because of course, what you're always looking for is something that is deficient, which is what a gap is. And if you can fill it in, then of course you've done something really sort of valuable and worthwhile. And finally, engages the reader in critically thinking about the issues based on an evidence-based interpretation of the findings. And of course, the point back discussions, that this is it's the point at which, if you've not done this previously, the chapter should be imbued with you. What have you done? Why have you done it? How have you done it? And what sense have you made? So you're not just merely a bystander, you are sort of part of the process. And indeed, in so doing, it's a sort of very essential sort of aspect of sort of demonstrating your doctoralness, if that's the sort of a word that we care to use, your scholastic ability to be sort of admitted to the club of being a doctoral student. No more, but certainly no less. But obviously, there's a lot to this. But you should, by the end of this chapter, feel confident that you've told a sort of a persuasive story. Remember, that word is important. Why should the person reading this be persuaded that you've done a sort of a good job in terms of providing the sort of the knowledge that you've put together in terms of the thesis. Okay, what else are the general rules? Because of course there's nothing absolutely fixed about this, but quite clearly there are some sort of good aspects of practice, and having been involved in many sort of doctoral theses and sort of vivas, you're looking for certain things. It shouldn't be overly wordy. I mean, and again, the big skill that we all have to sort of to develop. Writing is like everything. It's like acting, it's like painting, it's like running. The more we do it, the better we sort of become and hone our technique. Some people are sort of naturally very good at it. Most of us are not, so we have to sort of to do this. But being able to write, as I've said, economically and making arguments and the narrative concise is really helpful. And again, I'm the world's worst, if I admit, of overplaying it and trying to sort of to give all the information. What you want to do is to tell the reader what's gone on, why, as I was going to say fast, but in a sort of a way which doesn't lose their interest. And indeed, the sort of the most persuasive chapters in this regard are those which actually sort of tell a fast-moving story, as it were. So it's now obviously it's not a novel as such, but it should be sort of something which tells the sort of reader things that they perhaps didn't know previously, and they can understand the sort of way in which your journey has twisted and turned and arrived at the sort of particular destination. And again, I like the idea of a journey, because quite often that where you end up, in certainly a lot of the studies I've been involved in, it's very different to where you sort of originally envisaged. And again, part of that is preconceived notions, which most particularly is guided by the sort of literature that you will have looked at in the first instance, because of course that is the sort of the background to the study. Avoid language that's hard to understand to the non-specialist reader. Now, of course, this may sort of seem a little counterintuitive, because of course you are writing for normally an academic audience. One of my big bugbears of academic papers is quite often that they are impenetrable. But the sort of the best academic papers and books are those which are really accessible. And indeed, this is a piece of really good advice. A PhD thesis should not be something that sort of nobody understands. Now, I appreciate if you're writing something on quantum physics, it's going to be extremely difficult because, of course, that's the nature of the topic. But at the same sort of time, the real skill is to sort of to make it so that any sort of casual reader can pick this thing up and make sense of it in such a way as they didn't need the sort of the degree of background knowledge. So it should, the emphasis should be upon simplification, or making the complex things simple and not making simple things complex, which is what we often tend to do. Obviously, this is something that should guide us in everything we do, to be logical and coherent, and to make sure it all links together. And I've talked about this already, but to think through the sort of the logical sort of stages in putting together the thesis, and the sort of the way in which it has a sort of logical starting point, and it has a logical completion point, and in between, of course, is the sort of the collection of the data. But obviously, in fact, I've missed out the other bit, which of course is the literature. But the literature guides you in the first instance, the sort of methodology about collecting the data. And this is the chapter where it all should come together, and that if there are deficiencies or things that sort of are disconnected, then this is the point at which you have to start to sort of to either reconcile, and as I sort of also suggested a couple of minutes ago, you might have to start sort of to be judicious in terms of your editing, take things out that you thought were quite important, or very important perhaps, at the beginning, because of course they no longer have the sort of the degree of relevance that you did. And again, just to add the health warning, what people often tend to try and do is they cover as many bases as possible, and particularly covering a number of disciplines in the hope, of course, that they can reconcile it all at the end. My experience of that is, of course, the sort of the difficulty there is that sort of you end up trying to sort of cover so many bases that you're completely sort of paralyzed by the sort of the amount of sort of literature that you're trying to sort of cope with, and of course necessarily the data that may shoot in different directions also. Just coming back to sort of the general sort of aspect of sort of how to sort of to write this thing, subheadings, again, I've seen chapters which start at the title, and the next time you see another title is the next chapter, and given that sort of this is going to be a pretty meaty chapter. Now, of course, the question you might ask is what size, but it could easily be sort of 10,000 words, because it's a sort of fairly significant part. So if nothing else, think about how it sort of appears to the reader. And it, as I say, what you're trying to do is to sort of show the sort of degree of organization in terms of the sort of the overlay of the subheadings. Subheadings are nothing if not sort of signposts to the reader, and they help to sort of to break up the text. And of course, the whole point about sort of presenting your sort of reading is to sort of make it easy for the person who's coming to it for the first time to see the sort of the way in which it's evolved, developed, and that there is a sort of a logical flow. And again, the other thing is that, remember, we're all time poor, and the persons that read, or the persons, because it's normally two, and maybe 3 or 4 in some cases, and possibly even more, dare I say it, that they don't necessarily have tremendous amounts of time. Normally you're expected to be able to read a thesis in a sort of day, and you might have to sort of reread it. But the easier you can make that task for the person, the better. They become much more inclined to sort of to giving you I wouldn't say an easy time, but it makes their job easier. And of course, they hopefully will sort of give you some sort of benefit when it comes to the Viva proper. Okay, the organisation and structure. So there's 4 slides attached to this one. So commence by restating the problem. And obviously you can review where you've got to. And again, as I've said on a number of occasions so far, it may be that this is the point at which you sort of you describe why the sort of the problem has shifted, and there may be very good reasons for that, but quite clearly, and why the sort of the problem, as stated in the introduction, is different to what you thought you were going to sort of do. That's a very sort of valuable part of your own personal sort of learning and journey, and it helps others to understand the way in which that this process doesn't always go in a sort of straight line. Present discussion as an inverted pyramid. So you can see there, sort of going from the general to specific, because of course it's very useful then. That's how we often start. We look at a sort of broad area, broad problem, and then we focus it down as we sort of become more proficient and competent and confident in sort of understanding what is what and what is important. From the perspective of those involved, or the data that we've elicited, which tells us what is the sort of the crucial aspect of the sort of the issues underlying the theory that we're interested in. And again, I appreciate I'm talking in very abstract terms, but quite clearly that the more that you sort of narrow it down, the better. If nothing else, because of course it makes your job easier. In terms of, sort of this word I like to use, boundedness, because the sort of the wider the sort of the field is, the harder it is to actually sort of to provide that sense of focus. Okay, use the same key terms, narrative style and tense, verb tense, present, they've used when describing the research problem in the introduction. So keep it sort of simple and consistent, so don't move from one to the other. Because that, even though, of course, as I can necessarily understand, this is all going to be written in a sort of retrospective fashion. But as I say, it's written in the sort of the as we're sort of doing it, which is the sort of the way that you'll be interviewed, or sort of examined rather, because of course it is still very much a live problem. Finally, as far as this slide is concerned, describe the patterns, the principles, relationships by each of the major findings, and place them in their sort of their relative perspective. Obviously sequencing important. First state the answer, then the relevant results, and then cite the works of others, because of course this is really important in terms of sort of being able to situate your work and show how you've advanced the sort of the existing sort of knowledge, and you've added to it, because of course, as I say, that is for any examiner of PhD work, the sort of the acid test of success. Second slide. Refer readers to sort of figures or tables, and of course, as I fully understand that pictures and tables and sort of whatever other sort of visual information you provide are really useful. The picture paints 1,000 words is absolutely true, and it's a great way of summarizing. Obviously, I also appreciate that sort of if you're using a qualitative approach, it's lots of interview data. So you're not going to sort of just put in, you put in excerpts of the sort of the narrative or the sort of the interview data, but you don't sort of just put the whole thing in. Or you may wish to sort of put it in an appendix or appendices, but do remember that the sort of the examiner is under no duty to read appendices, because they're there for background interest, that they can if they wish, but they're only sort of required to examine the main body of the text. So nonetheless, the more that you can summarize, if you can usefully sort of use pictorial representations to simplify that process, then that is no bad thing. Include in the analysis any unexpected findings. Again, I keep emphasizing this because unexpected findings are good. They're problematic, but good, because of course it means if you didn't expect it, what does that mean? And I choose to believe that you didn't expect it because it didn't exist in sort of the literature, and therefore, of course, what you're trying to do as a result of that then is to sort of, well, not as a result, by being able to highlight this, you've demonstrated new knowledge. The description should begin with a description of the unanticipated findings, followed by a brief interpretation as to why you believe it appeared, and if necessary, the possible significance in relation to the overall study. So, what does this tell you about what's going on, and why the sort of the interpretation is different to what you thought you might have found at the outset of the study. And if you find more unexpected things, then sort of describe each of them in order, because of course it's all part of the sort of the useful process of telling the reader what you did or how you did it, and what immersed you in the study. And dare I say, if somebody sort of then reads your sort of thesis subsequently, they will sort of be able to better understand what the process that they will be involved in. They'll be forewarned about what may happen. It's good experience, and will help them, which of course is no bad thing. Third slide. Before concluding the discussion, identify limitations and weaknesses, if you don't plan to do this in the conclusion, because this is also, again, very useful. And of course, the thing about this is that there's no such thing as complete knowledge. All you can do is to sort of provide snapshots, and a thesis is normally 80,000 words long. You can't do everything, so you have to sort of recognize that sort of in what's a relatively short period of time, normally 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years, you will have done a lot, but you can't do everything. So and it's better, in my opinion, to identify the issues, rather than sort of allow the examiner to sort of to point them out to you, in which case you've sort of kind of it's not so much that you're trying to undermine them or in any way. What you're trying to do is to show that you've thought through the sort of the issues, and of course what this may then lead to is the sort of the gaps that you've been able to identify that you've not fully bridged, that others may sort of pick up on subsequently. So it's a good part of the sort of continuing research debate. Comment on the relative importance of your findings and interpretations, and also if you think that there are things which were problematic in terms of what you were able to do, particularly, of course, if there's an access issue. Sometimes you get into organizations and you don't get access to all the areas that you thought you would, which limited the study, then point that out, because, of course, what you hope is that everyone will give you as much access to the data, or the sort of the experiences and the sort of the observation of the sort of things going on that you wish, but of course there may be good reasons why this is not always possible. So point that out. Avoid using an apologetic note. Be honest and self-critical. And okay, and of course this is also the sort of point at which that sort of, if you include a particular question in the survey instrument, because again, nothing is perfect, and this will be one of the sort of the questions that many examiners like to ask is, if you've been started again, would you have done it differently? And if you can say how by adopting a different approach and asking different questions and coming at it from a different angle, you'd have been more successful or provided a different sort of set of answers. That again is no bad thing. Okay, and finally, at the end with a concise summary of the principal implications, the findings. So, this is where you sort of put it into a sort of a nutshell, maybe a sort of a set of bullet points, but certainly a sort of a short paragraph. What have you actually achieved, allied to a brief explanation about why you believe your findings and conclusions are important and will support the sort of the broader sort of knowledge base through to understand the research problem. So again, that seems fairly sort of fundamental, but again, it's worth doing. The more you can sort of restate. I'm a great fan, if I may say, in all chapters, but this in particular, at the beginning, an introduction which kind of links it to what's come before, and then a short summary at the end, which of course shows what you've discovered. And of course, you then use that as the sort of the launching pad for the next one, the next chapter, what will sort of follow that. State any recommendations for further research if you believe that's appropriate. But again, that's a difficult one, because of course the fact is though that's what may happen in the future. You can't be examined on what may occur in the future, because that's not part of the brief. But nonetheless, by being able to sort of state this, state what you think has happened, will be what you think others may be able to do in terms of sort of reevaluating and developing your research, is no bad thing, because it shows that you're thinking about the sort of the issues that may arise from the study you've carried out. Okay, explain the sort of this is kind of sort of view of the sort of what we just talked about. The important point about this chapter is that at this stage you are in the sort of the research area that you're interested in, and the things that you've done. You're the expert. Okay, the fact is that sort of at least one of your examiners will be sort of selected on the basis that they are the sort of a noted and seminal sort of author and academic in that particular area, but they may not have the sort of the full level of expertise that you have about the issue that you've examined, because of course, logically you've come at it from a different perspective to create this new knowledge. So even though that they're perfectly qualified to sort of make this comment, make this comment, that there is also sort of the issue that sort of that they have to, excuse me, somebody sort of interrupted me, that they will know what it is that you've been up to, but at the same sort of time, it is important then to sort of to recognise that there is you're the sort of person, you're in command, and indeed you should have that sort of that breadth and competence to sort of to be able to sort of to judge accordingly, or to explain yourself accordingly. Systematically explain the underlying meaning of your findings and state why you believe that they should convince the reader. And of course, in this case, as I keep coming back to, if you're in a viva, then the readers are the sort of people who are going to judge your doctoralness, so that they should be sort of convinced by what you do. This is an interesting one which I picked up, but it just happened to me, and it is very frustrating. If the reader has to keep going through backwards and forwards to sort of make sense, you've not done as good a job, I think, as you may have done in making this thing simple and accessible. I think this is a really good word. Make this thing so any person or any casual reader can pick this up, and they can sort of see what you're up to. And because of course, if you do that, it keeps their interest. It's an engaging piece of work. Be willing to consider the most important, or indeed unanticipated findings first, because of course these have the greatest significance and persuasiveness. And of course, that's very logical to sort of deal with the big things and then work your way down the list. Of course, I would also suggest if you've got a list that's 20 or 30 long, then perhaps there's a degree, or there's certainly sort of, there is a point at which people sort of become a bit bored. You then have to be sort of, as I say, judicious in that, thinking about the sort of the top, I don't know, half a dozen issues perhaps, and then relegate the rest of them perhaps to an appendix, if that's what you think is necessary, because there is a danger if you overload the reader with too many different things. It's very difficult to sort of to disentangle what's important and what is not so important. So importance and significance are really key words in all of this. Of course, this is always in your mind, making sure that what you've done connects to sort of the literature. And even though you're obviously trying to build upon that literature and the sort of the existing knowledge and theory, if you're able to sort of to critique it in such a way as to sort of show that it was deficient, then don't be frightened to do so, because of course that's part of what the sort of the academic game is about. But of course you've got to be able to be confident that you're able to sort of do so, or demonstrate in the sort of discussion that you present in the narrative why that this is so. So use to show your findings, show how findings from previous studies provide the basis of your selected questions, how that sort of put you or sent you in a particular direction, and then of course how the sort of the research findings compare and contrast to other studies that sort of been carried out, and of course what your study is, where it's different and provides this new knowledge, because of course that is the sort of the key component of what you're sort of trying to show in terms of what you've done, that yours is significance, and indeed you advance the sort of the body of knowledge. And as I've said on a few occasions already, if you can sort of do this in such a way as to sort of to show what you've done has significance, then of course that's a sort of really big tick in terms of being able to sort of achieve the sort of the doctoral qualification. Okay, some alternative explanation of the findings. Remember, the purpose of research is to discover and not necessarily to prove, although again there's heated debate about that, but discovery and advancing knowledge is made possible by the sort of the ability to surface things which perhaps don't sort of entirely sort of line with sort of preconceived notions or theories. You get no more, no less. When you're writing in your discussion chapter, carefully consider all possible explanations. So again, be careful about this. You can't engage in sort of idle speculation, but if you can provide a useful sort of and logical sort of explanation and description, then that's it. Again, things which are sort of weird, which is quite unusual and idiosyncratic, and even then I would suggest that there will be particular reasons, but when you go into organization, things happen often despite and not because of the sort of the management systems and decision making and leadership and all the other things that sort of come into play. Okay, and don't exclude anything that sort of doesn't sort of align with your sort of preconceived beliefs or biases, because that they have come from what you thought was important, which of course has been sort of influenced or hugely and heavily influenced by what you've read. But what exists in the sort of the knowledge previously may not necessarily sort of be accurate or representative of what you find. And of course, again, this is really crucial when dealing with significant or unanticipated findings. Again, I probably don't need to sort of to spend too much time on this, but if you think that there are limitations to what you've done, then address them. State any unanswered questions or issues not addressed, because if you put them in at the beginning, I mean, again, this comes back to sort of to where you start off. But if there are things that you were not able to achieve, that there's probably good reasons for so doing. If you can't provide good reasons, then any examiner worth their salt, as it were, will sort of they'll question you on it. Why didn't you sort of explain that? Explain how results may be specific and not applicable to other situations. So what you've done may not be as generalizable, which is another wonderful word, that as people would like to, just because it happened in one particular situation or happened in the circumstances or on the basis of the data that you've collected, it may not necessarily sort of be true in all circumstances. And if there's a limitation for the method that you've chosen to gather information, then describe in detail the problems that you encountered and why, because of course this is really sort of useful learning. of what's going on, or what you did and why you did it. And of course, you'll then be able to sort of say, by doing it differently in the future, or if you had done it differently, you've got different results. But also, more particularly, it helps others who sort of may subsequently sort of use your work to advance their understanding. They can sort of perhaps adopt a better approach, which will make their sort of their work more efficient and effective. But of course, undoubtedly, they will have problems on the way, because that's always the nature of research. It's never as linear and as predictable as you'd like it to be. Should you make sort of suggestions concerning further research? Yeah, there's different views in this. I mean, quite clearly, you can't be necessarily examined on sort of what you think may happen in the future, because that's purely speculative. But also, the point is, though, that by thinking about how your sort of work may be advanced in the future, and the different approaches that may be taken, it shows the sort of the completeness of the sort of piece of work, and how sort of research may be advanced through what you've done, which of course means, of course, that you've assisted in the sort of the developing the body of knowledge. And using alternative situations. What I'm saying about this is, if you've carried out your study in one particular discipline or sector, as I've used the word there, that's fine, and a whole set of circumstances and cultural influences may be relevant. By doing it in a different set of circumstances and culture, you may get a different sort of set of responses if the sort of the issue that you have has applicability or relevance elsewhere. And again, in management, management occurs in all sectors, but it doesn't always occur in the same way even in the same sectors. Of course, it has variability depending upon the sort of nature of the organisation and what they do. But again, be willing to sort of to think beyond, because of course that may be helpful. And indeed, it may be suggestions how people can pick your work up and apply it, or attempt to sort of to explore it in those circumstances. Okay. Some do nots. Don't waste time restating results. If you've done that, if you've presented in the chapter in sort of a very sort of dispassionate way, that's all that you need to do. The results are the results, the data is the data. The discussion is where you sort of make sense and interpret. And I've never ever present new results in discussion, because of course it has to have some basis, and it has to come from the data, because that's what drives the research. You can't start discussing things that you have no connection, because that's a no-no. Do not present two results sections. Refer to results when discussing. Focus on interpretation and significance. That's what's going on in this chapter, not, as I say, a rerun, as it were. This may seem a bit strange. Don't over-interpret the results. Approach selection and interpretation of findings introspectively, and be aware of the judgmental biases that you may have imposed. You may impose as to sort of relevance and or importance. And of course, the point about this is that sort of if people often have hobby horses about what they thought was important, but if the sort of the relevance importance shifts, then and also because of course of your sort of your biases, you may have missed something. And indeed, be careful about this one, because try and see it through the sort of the eyes of others. So as a worldly view as possible. So think about how others may see what you've discovered, and what their interpretation may be, and to try and sort of look at it in the round, as it were. The final one is, do not read more into the findings that can be supported by the evidence. It's quite clear that's it. If the data doesn't support it, then it doesn't support it. Anything else then is it's a little over speculative, to say the least. Any discussion is purely based on what you discovered, no more or no less. Do not try to generalize or apply to other contexts if inappropriate. You may suggest or make suggestions, but you can't still say how it may or may not apply, because you've got no evidence. And because of how your work is applied and its impact on the basis of what seems obvious in the data. Speculation is not required, and it's helpful. Okay, I'm conscious of time. Remember, the key is reasoned and justifiable commentary on the importance of findings. Always place emphasis on larger issues, which might hinge on the findings. Think about sort of the theoretical and practical significance of the findings, because of course that's the sort of the nature of what any sort of PhD work is or indeed any piece of work that is about sort of advancing knowledge, must adhere to, or that principle. Are the findings valid? But of course, they're valid because the data supports it, or the data and your interpretation of what the data does. But be prepared, people may have a different interpretation, and that's part of the discussion that will go on. So try and sort of see it, as I say, from others' perspective. Is there a real life phenomena which might be explained by your results? And again, this is the sort of the practical application that this work will have in the future. And then finally, what problems remain unresolved or arise because of your findings? And of course, this is a difficult one for some people because it may seem that you're posing more questions than answers. Well, you'll have answered some questions, but in any good piece of research, it's never complete. There's always more that can be done in the future, and that's the nature of civilized society. We're always trying to find better ways, or more effective ways, or more efficient ways of the things we do and living the way that we choose to. And dare I say, come back in 100 years' time, and they'll probably look back on us as being somewhat primitive in what we did and how we thought. But hey, that's the sort of nature of advanced society. Okay, right. So the further research and training to develop the well, in fact, what I will do at this point, I'll sort of stop sharing, because, or at least I'll invite Jack to sort of take over. But as you can see, of course, the whole point of these courses that sort of they don't entirely stand alone. There are plenty more opportunities to sort of to advance your skills. So
okay,
Jack.
Yes, we also have Anna with us, who's one of the co-founders. There's a series of different advanced courses and various clubs available that gives you quite a few different insights to draw on. Did you want to add anything to that at all, Anna?
No, I think that exactly is rather invitation to explore our homepage and exactly understand which is the fit at this point in time. You have the courses, you have the clubs. We are expanding also on the type of clubs we will introduce to exactly be there for you at the point you are within your research. So we're welcome to explore, and then exactly if there's after the discussion we will hold now, if there's something, I will definitely follow up with you.
Okay, I might actually turn off the recording and
that's what
leave it
I was
for
also
questions.
going to